Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 1st of September 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're joined today by David Scott with Northern Exposure. Where do we start?
We start with the government promoting modern slavery. This is my allegation anyway. This is the headline on their press release is that the UK is cracking down on modern slavery. This comes out of following on from what we were talking about yesterday with Priti Patel and Boris Johnson being in Nigeria. And they've issued this statement saying that the UK is cracking down on the barbaric crime of modern slavery. And this is according to International Development Secretary Priti Patel. And she's called for a world free from what they describe as this abhorrent trade. So she visited a safe house in Nigeria yesterday, which is home to child victims as young as 7. And she met survivors of modern slavery and announced increased support to provide alternative jobs and livelihoods for potential victims of trafficking and modern slavery. So that's all very good. Here's what Priti Patel had to say. The UK is a global leader in stamping out modern slavery, and I've in brackets added on, you can see how she can say that with a straight face. I don't know how she can say it with a straight face. She said it's shameful that in the 21st century, the evil crime of modern slavery lurks in every corner of the globe, including on the UK streets, destroying the lives of young men, women and children. We will not stand aside and ignore the barbaric and often invisible crime, which is all too often reaches our shores and is damaging for everyone except the perpetrators. Of course, the key point here is that Theresa May brought in the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. So I thought it'd be worthwhile just having a look at how effective that has been. Because, of course, the profits that are made from modern slavery globally, around £120 billion a year. And on the left-hand side, you can see that £120 billion. And on the right-hand side, you can see how much money the government funds the prevention of modern slavery.
I can't see anything there at all, Mark.
Well, in fact, it's £11 million.
Okay.
So the profits, not the turnover, the profits are £120 billion, and the government is funding prevention to £11 million. That's fantastic, isn't it? So let's look at sexual exploitation. This is just in the UK, almost £900 million profit a year from sexual exploitation as a result of human trafficking. And as we say, the government funding for the prevention is 11 million. Now, of course, that's not all funding because there are other budgets for the things like the National Crime Agency, but the National Crime Agency massively underfunded. So the general point is, as I'm suggesting there. So let's have a look and see how effective. This is just Britain. In Britain, so people coming to Britain as a result of human trafficking, between 2015 and 2016, this rose by 70.7%, or at least that's an estimate, because of course we don't actually know what the true figures are. This figure is based on the referrals to the National Crime Agency. So in other words, this is people that have come across people in their daily lives that they think may be the victims of human trafficking, and they've referred those individuals to the National Crime Agency for investigation, and the National Crime Agency has not completed investigation on many of these cases.
So you can extrapolate, I think is the correct word, these figures from some referrals. The problem is £120 billion worth, but you get some referrals and then you extrapolate.
Right.
And you provide 11 million funding.
That's right. Now, what was really fascinating about the comments from the UK government was that they made a direct comparison between human trafficking and the profits made in human trafficking and the drug trafficking trade. And this is a parallel that I've drawn in the past as well, because it's the same business model. But anyway, let's have a look at the situation in the UK with modern slavery referrals. And when we break down the types of modern slavery as a result of human trafficking that there are in the UK, we find that a very small proportion of it is what's described as domestic servitude, a bit more in labour slavery, labour-related slavery. They say that there's no organ harvesting goes on in the UK at all. I don't believe that for a second, but that's what the National Crime Agency says. The vast majority of modern slavery in the UK is a result of sexual exploitation. So people being brought to this country, and now what I want to point out here is that the graph that I have on screen at the moment is only for UK nationals. So many people think that modern slavery and human trafficking only refers to people that have come into this country as a result of illegal immigration or whatever. But what I've got on screen at the moment is referring to UK nationals that have been stolen from UK streets and pushed into sexual slavery or labour. How does this happen in a first world country?
Because the government permits criminal activity at every turn, Mike, and we'll be having a look a little bit later at child abuse, where we've got some very interesting things starting to happen.
Right. So let's overlay this graphic then with some red bars, and those red bars are the proportion of people in modern slavery in the UK. Again, UK nationals in this case, who are under the age of 17. And as we can see, the majority of sexual slavery, like 95% of sexual slavery in this country, is children.
Right, and we put that nice little word, exploitation. They're sort of exploited in some way. It's not really abuse, it's exploiting.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're only scratching the surface of this here, but I absolutely stick by my original allegation. Britain, through Priti Patel and the Department for International Development, is promoting modern slavery because they are not funding the response correctly. Just as with the drugs trade, we don't fund the response directly, and therefore we actually encourage modern slavery and human trafficking. And I think that it's pretty despicable that the UK government continues to underfund the efforts to stop this, even though it's not only illegal immigrants, but also UK nationals that are affected by this. David, briefly, what are your thoughts?
We were discussing just before the break, Mike, the size of this. The Office of National Statistics has published figures earlier this year. They reckon there was 60,879 prostitutes in Britain, and the GDP contributed by that came to 5.314 billion, and that was female prostitution. If you add on male prostitution, then you're up to over 8.6 billion. And this is, as you quite rightly say, largely children. And you asked the question there, how does this happen in a third world country? Well, I was speaking to one of the victims, and she was a 14-year-old girl in a care home in state care, frightened. There was violent assaults in this home every night. She was terrified, and a seemingly caring person running this home said, "Oh, a pretty girl like you doesn't need to stay here. I can make a phone call. I can get you out of here. You won't have to do anything. You just have to go to dinner with a few men. Pretty girl like you, you'll be sorted." And then she found herself in the most horrendous situations. And that's how it's very often happening. It's coming from the care system.
Interesting that you a bit of a Freudian slip there, David. You said third world country. I think Britain increasingly is behaving like a third world country.
Well, indeed, yes. I'll try and avoid that, but I'm maybe just getting in early.
Yes. Okay, well, let's talk about the Isle of Man then, David.
Well, this is an extract here from the Kathy Fox blog, which is an excellent blog focusing on children and child abuse. And it's looking at some figures here produced from a Norwegian report, a Norwegian online magazine, VJ Helm. They studied downloads of child pornography that they had got data on from Norway, and plotted its course around the world. And they found there was 149 internet IP addresses in the Isle of Man downloading child pornography, which makes it hugely, disproportionately, the most per head of population anywhere on the planet. So this is obviously of great concern. The scale of the thing overall, this study reported on 430,000 files, 430,000 files showing sexual abuse of children. And these were downloaded to 95,000 IP addresses across the world. So just truly horrendous. And it shows that there's these 149 addresses in the Isle of Man. It's not clear whether that reflects simply what's happening with a group of people in the Isle of Man downloading such material, or whether there's something else behind this that's using the Isle of Man as an intermediary. I'm not clear on that, but there's no reason at the moment to doubt the figures actually do reflect what's happening on the Isle of Man itself, which is clearly a major concern, because this sort of behaviour leads to abuse, or rather, as Irishman Joe Sullivan, an expert on the risk assessment of sexual predators, he commented, the question is not whether or not the downloaders will commit abuse, it's whether they already have and in what context. He found around 80% of people who downloaded sexual abuse images and video of children were already, or admitted to already having abused children.
David, if I may, who was the organisation that obtained this information? I missed that. If you've actually told us.
It came from a Norwegian online magazine, VJ Helm, and it's reported here in the Cathy Fox blog.
Right. I just find it fascinating that we have that as the source of this data. We have GCHQ. We have MI5, we have MI6, we have the security services here in UK. They don't appear to be able to track this sort of data down. I find there's a fascinating dichotomy.
Indeed, the lack of protection that our security services are providing to the country is quite striking.
So what are the links then? I think this goes back a couple of years, this article, but the headline is Isle of Man policy compounds the named person fears. And of course, the named person scheme, the guardian for every child in Scotland. So what was the concern here?
Well, it struck me that this dramatic figure is from the Isle of Man, and the Isle of Man in this context I only know from one source, which is they ran a named person-like scheme several years before the SNP administration introduced it into Scotland, and it was a complete disaster. The result was a 1,560% increase in referrals to social services. The system fell apart, basically. Now, whether that's related to the figures on viewing child sexualized imagery, I don't know, but it's an odd coincidence that the one place where named person was introduced, with all the attendant disasters, is the place where viewing child abuse online is, per head of population, the most popular.
Okay, well, let's move to Scotland then. And well, this is a bit historic, but the headline from the Mail on Sunday, I think, is Lust Triangle, Sauna Shame Sheriff was a regular at seedy strip bars. Now, of course, for our US audience, sheriff in Scotland is not the same as a sheriff in the United States or even in England. So just a sheriff is equivalent to what, a magistrate, a judge of some kind?
It's a judge, yes, yeah. Yes, and this is a sheriff principal, so this was a senior judge. And the reason, it is an older story, this man died in 2016. The reason that I wanted to raise it today is following on from what you said about child trafficking and the child abuse system. Remember how it's actually working. The children are being trafficked out of care homes, out of the care system, and vulnerable children are being identified and trafficked into the saunas and into the pornography and principally the prostitution industries. Now, that's how it works, and it's huge, right? It's 8.6 billion a year in this country. It's absolutely massive. Now, here we see a senior judge in Scotland who for years was using these same saunas. Now, people say saunas and think, well, it's maybe a bit seedy, but they kind of go to sleep on this. It's not a bit seedy. These are young girls being horribly abused, and it's so bad that the body can only take it for a few years. So after 2 or 3 or 4 years, they're cast aside into the mental health system and the NHS, and they become the flotsam and jetsam of damaged people that this industry generates. and they need to get a whole new set of girls. So the trafficking is constant. So here you had a senior judge using that system. So he was presiding over cases all around Scotland, and he was actually part of that, right? Easily blackmailable, completely corrupt. Now, Lord Gill, when asked about a register of interests for our judiciary, said, oh no, we don't need anything like that in Scotland because our judiciary are the finest. Our judiciary are so squeaky clean. There is no problem. There is no corruption. There is not an issue. There's not even a suggestion of an issue. Now, he said that. There's not a suggestion of any sort of impropriety, any sort of corruption in the Scottish judiciary after all of this came to light. So they're lying to us. And we're seeing people going into the very serious parts of life and being completely compromised, but they're still sitting there at the very highest decision-making points in the land, and that's how the control is exerted. Because he would be easily blackmailable. There'll be lots of videos and all the rest of it. So he's not going to find against the wrong person at the wrong time. Yeah. So this is how the control operates, and the authorities knew. This man's wife reported him many times to the authorities that he was unfit to be a sheriff, to be a judge, but it was ignored.
It was ignored, and so the cover-up continues, and what better time to bring in the BBC. Now, I'm going to thank the viewer who alerted me to this one, because the article's dated the 18th of August 2017, so we were away at the time, didn't pick up on this, but it's an ex-BBC reporter, Liz McKean, dies after a stroke. And I think there's some very, very interesting material in this article. The lady was only 52. There's no detail at all about her death, but at the age of 52, she unfortunately suffers from a stroke. This was the lady who had been doing the investigation into Jimmy Savile and child abuse within the BBC. But the BBC reports it in a very carefully contrived way. So here we are. McKean, 52, worked for the corporation for more than 20 years, but left in 2013 amid a row over the decision to shelve her investigation for Newsnight about disgraced Jimmy Savile. And it goes on, it talks about her work in Northern Ireland, where she won the trust of all sides and produced some of the most insightful and hard-hitting reporting of the conflict. And she was an investigative reporter that really shone, shining the light on issues from the dumping of toxic waste to Jimmy Savile. I've just highlighted the change in style because the initial report is that Jimmy Savile, in their opening paragraph, is just a bit disgraced, Mike. It's just disgraced Jimmy Savile. And then later on, we talk about the good work that she did regarding toxic waste. And Jimmy Savile was just a story. It's very, very clever the way that this article's been put together, because of course the BBC doesn't want to go near her work to do with the abuse of children. And have a look at this one. This is the Daily Mail. Unrepentant BBC journalist caught with a sick collection of child abuse images on his home computer. He blamed the people who made the videos. He said he wasn't really doing anything wrong, but he didn't go to jail.
No, well, you wouldn't.
No. And here's the Independent, same story. BBC journalist given suspended sentence for making and possessing child sex abuse images. So it said that photographs and videos were found from all three categories used by the courts to classify the gravity of the child sex abuse images, and these included the most severe classification. That includes rape, bestiality and sadism. So the Independent didn't mess around there. It said what was actually going on. So let's come back to the BBC. And what did the BBC say in its article? Well, it did mention 26 videos and 9 images, but it said one video showed abuse, including a young girl who was clearly distressed.
Right.
So my suggestion is that the BBC has deliberately crafted its report on this BBC reporter in order to keep the heat off the BBC. And the other remarkable thing is no pictures of this gentleman at all. Sorry, if you Google The image, or you look for an image, on Google itself, a search will bring you up with this gentleman, and it does link you through to a video on YouTube. So we believe that this is the gentleman concerned. But isn't it remarkable that a BBC reporter is apparently anonymous in the BBC reports and in the mainstream press? So the BBC, crafting its articles to do with child abuse to make sure that the death of an investigative reporter is not covered properly, one of its own journalists viewing child pornography, well, that's carefully kept down.
So just to clarify, if you're a BBC journalist who is investigating child abuse within the BBC, you get sacked. But if you're a BBC journalist who's actually involved in child abuse to some degree, you get a suspended sentence?
Absolutely correct, Mike. So I thought we'd just remind against that excellent summary what we reported yesterday, which was this gentleman, Mark Fields from the Foreign Office, who said that the BBC was just the organisation to broadcast the truth to North Korea. So if we have anybody from North Korea who's watching the UK Column News report, I hope you'll understand that at least some of us here in UK understand the way that propaganda from the British government works. This, David, this is pretty disgusting stuff. It is becoming increasingly easy to see through the BBC's cover-up of child abuse.
Yes, the BBC's coverage there, they said, well, there was one image and the girl was distressed. Is the BBC's position that if a child is abused so often that they don't show distress anymore because they're numb, that makes it okay, or that makes it less reprehensible? It's ridiculous. It's just appalling. The underlying belief system that comes through in everything the BBC write about this is just hideous.
Hideous. Well, let's give an update on Melanie Shaw. Now, this was happening a couple of weeks ago. I couldn't comment on it at the time, but Melanie had been able to make contact with a member of the public. She said that she thought she was going to be released about the middle of August, but the date she had, the 13th of August, turned out to be a Sunday, so we knew this wasn't correct. But then there was a phone call from Melanie to say she was out, but she couldn't give a location. She would have served roughly 50% of her 2-year sentence, so it seemed possible. The phone call from Melanie said she was out, but this turned out to be only part of the story, because Melanie was taken from Newhall Prison to a location which we think was in Birmingham. She stayed overnight in a particularly filthy hostel. But on the second night, at some time in the night, we think it was about 2 o'clock, police turned up. And according to Melanie, she was told that she had breached her conditions. And the next thing, she was bundled in a car and taken to a new location. Now, I've only become aware of that location today, so this is very recent news. If we just pop that one back up, Mike. So we know that Melanie Shaw has now been taken out of Foston Hall, and her new location is Eastwood Park, Fallfield, Wootton-under-Edge in Gloucester. And in a letter which I've received, Melanie is saying that she's now on a psychiatric ward surrounded by extremely disturbed women. So this is what British Prime Minister Theresa May does with child abuse whistleblowers. As Home Secretary, she ensures that they're given long prison sentences. And then we're not sure at the moment whether Melanie is in a proper prison system or she's one of the so-called black prisoners. That was a term first used by MP John Hemming for prisoners who were actually being held unlawfully in the United Kingdom. So UK might just the country to sort out international trafficking.
Okay, David, let's go back to Scotland then for a second. And this is a Diary of Injustice in Scotland blog. Silencers in court. What's going on with guns?
Yes, this is looking at the firearms held by officials, by police officers, by judges, by lawyers, and similar officials in the Scottish legal system. And it transpires that they hold really rather a lot. There are 327 police officers in Scotland who have firearms certificates. Sorry, 161 hold firearms certificates, 285 hold shotgun certificates. Amongst those holding firearm certificates, they hold 392 firearms and 216 sound modulators. That would be a silencer to you and me. So it does beg the question why Police Scotland, 216 silencers are in the private hands of Police Scotland officers. I can't actually think of a reason why you would need a silencer. But anyway, apparently you do. Now, it's very difficult to understand to get a permit for a silencer because of the obvious risk of crime, but it seems to be a lot easier to get a permit for these things if you're in fact a police officer or a judge or a lawyer. And this applies to other things as well, not only the number of firearms, but the quantity of ammunition that is held seems to be much higher for police officers and judges, etc., than for the general population. There's obviously a constant attempt to disarm the population, but these rules don't seem to apply equally everywhere.
So that's for police officers. What about judges? I mean, why would judges need? Are these for personal protection?
Well, no. I mean, they're not for personal protection, as far as I know. These seem to be hunting seems to be the main claim. But who knows? There's some very exotic weapons amongst them.
So what are you saying, David? Is there some kind of noise abatement legislation in place for hunting in Scotland?
Well, you would think that actually, as a safety measure, if someone's firing off a gun, you would really want to know about it. You would actually want the shot to be heard. And if it's silenced, then that would make it more dangerous, one would think.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'm just going to bring in the subject of child abuse again, but this is only as an introduction. Very interesting events going on in Rotherham at the moment. Reports are coming out on 6 child abuse cases. This was very kindly sent through to us by a gentleman from Sheffield. Thank you very much. Just pulled out a bit of information on this because here we've got the so-called child abuse investigation going on, but we see that 2 law firms have actually been carrying out the work. So we've got law firm Gowling, WLG, is due to reveal the outcome of the investigation into the conduct of senior staff employed by Rotherham Borough Council during the period covered by the Damning J report. And then it goes on to say that another report is being compiled by the law firm Waitmans, details of which have not been released. You'll be glad to know they're also looking into the theft of 21 laptops. So interesting situation where we're now using law firms to carry out investigations. And this is part of the report that Rotherham has released, the Commissioner's 18-month progress review, recovery and restoration. And this is all about how Rotherham is actually getting itself back together. Para 2 or Section 2, where we were. We weren't in a good place, but not to worry, Mike, because it's all coming good. But this is the key point. I was fascinated to get into this section where it calmly said that as part of the movement forward, powers were going to be returned to elected councillors. So apparently some of the powers have been taken away from democratically elected councillors. I don't know who the powers went to, but not to worry because they're going to be restored, just a few of them. So let's have a look at the few that have actually been restored. We've got education, we've got public health, leisure services, housing, planning and transportation, building regulation, financial services, budget control, policy. So here we're now starting to see in depth what's happening with local authorities, that they are no longer under any form of democratic control of constituents and voters. Who are the people controlling those local authorities?
Good question. Let's move on to defence. Michael Fallon was in France yesterday, Brian, to meet his French counterpart. And apparently they have announced between them that over the next few months, more than 2,500 British troops will train alongside their French counterparts, participating in exercises spanning from half the globe, it seems, from Eastern Europe to Kenya to a whole bunch of different places. And apparently this is being agreed, this new programme of UK-French training during the bilateral meeting which took place yesterday. So 1,500 British soldiers from 16 Air Assault Brigade will be joined by troops from the 11 Brigade Parachute Regiment on NATO's exercise Swift Response in Bulgaria. French troops are going to join 1,000 UK personnel from 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, in Kenya in November, and so it goes on. Michael Fallon was really impressed. He said the UK and France have a long enduring relationship, and that will continue as the UK leaves the European Union. We are deployed together in NATO, fighting against Daesh in Iraq and Syria, and training together across the globe, he said. But he didn't at any stage mention the Lancaster House Treaty, which we're still part of. This is something additional to the Lancaster House treaties. And of course, it's only the UK column, as far as I know, that have really focused on this over the years and how this fits into EU military integration. So this is continuing integration. He also mentioned, by the way, that France was perhaps going to provide some ships for defence of the aircraft carrier.
Well, that was always on the cards, Mike, because of course we don't have sufficient ships to provide a proper task force around that carrier. But this report from the UK column, we got it right at the time, a 50-year treaty, not debated in Parliament, simply David Cameron announcing that we're now friends with the French for 50 years and we're going to be integrating our military forces.
And it's that integration which sets what's going on in Europe apart, because of course there's defence cooperation happening in other parts of the world as well. So let's bring in Zapad 2017, which is the big Russian-Belarusian exercise which is taking place in September. This is they describe it as a joint strategic exercise under the Chiefs of General Staff of the Russian Federation and the Republic of Belarus. 12,500 troops, including 7,500 Belarusian troops, that's going to take place in Belarusia and in Kaliningrad and Leningrad as well. I find it interesting if you compare the scenarios of recent NATO exercises, Brian. Zapad is about internal defence because the scenario that they're planning for here is that some extremist groups have entered Russian territory, and how does the military deal with that situation? And I think we should contrast that with perhaps recent NATO exercises, which have been about an invasion from an external nation, which they said was a complete fictional entity, if I remember correctly. But of course, it was clearly meant to be Russia. So we should perhaps contrast that, because NATO has been whining for months now that it should be invited to observe the Zapad 2017 exercises, because this is really concerning for NATO. This is real Russian aggression at work here with this exercise, because Russia is daring to exercise close to the new nation NATO installations in Eastern Europe. It's horrendous. And in March this year, Jens Stoltenberg was meeting the Prime Minister of Estonia, and he had this to say: every nation has the right to exercise its forces as long as it's done within the agreed international obligations and relations. We should welcome an invitation to observe the Zapad exercises. Well, that invitation has now been made, and NATO has been invited to what are being described as visitors' days in Belarus, and also a visitors' day in Russia. NATO isn't really terribly happy about that. No, visitors' days aren't good enough, because under the international rules, they've got to monitors have to be given much wider access to only if they're Russian exercises, including briefings on the exercise, opportunities to talk to soldiers, and overflights, as according to Oana Lungesco from NATO. She said that the invitations that NATO had received are not a substitute for real observation under the Vienna Agreement. Russia and Belarus are instead choosing a selective approach that falls short. Such avoidance of mandatory transparency only raises questions about the nature and purpose of the exercise, she whined. It's pathetic, Brian. It's pathetic.
But very interesting that the Russians are taking the subject of subversion very seriously. And of course, there have already been attempts to date by George Soros-backed organisations to subvert Russia. And wasn't it the young Kinnock that was thrown out, I think, of Moscow at one stage for his work within one of these non-governmental organisations?
Okay, David, briefly on Israel. Interesting headline from The Independent here. Nearly half of Israeli Jews believe in ethnic cleansing, according to a survey. Who was behind the survey?
It's an outfit called the Pew Research Centre, who I've not looked into in detail, but they carried out this opinion survey. Now, there's one lie in the Independent headline there, and the lie is the word nearly. And the main text repeats that almost half of Jewish Israelis believe that Arabs should be expelled or transferred from Israel, a survey found. Now, what the survey actually found was 48% said that Arabs should be removed. Slightly fewer said they shouldn't be, and there was a few don't knows. So it's actually slightly more than half if you exclude the don't knows. Now, this was, they looked at this across different parts of the Jewish community and found, yes, okay, there was the Orthodox part of this, the Haredi, were more likely to want the Arabs removed than, say, the secularists. But it seemed to split basically along political lines. The right in Israel strongly favours Arabs being expelled, and the left does not. Now, a couple of comments on this. Israeli President Rivlin called the findings a wake-up call for Israeli society. No, the findings are actually just pointing at a truth here. The Israeli society is accused of many things. It's routinely accused of genocide. That's not true. It's routinely accused of being an apartheid state. That's not true. Or being a colonizing state. That's not true. Or imperialistic. That's not true. But the issue of ethnic cleansing, 1947-48, there was most certainly ethnic cleansing. And there's clearly a desire ongoing for more ethnic cleansing to make the land essentially all Jewish. And that is true. That is what a large percentage of the people believe. And that is the direction of the government. And this is an area that should be of great concern to anyone who believes that liberty, property rights, peace are necessary for us to thrive as a species. So on you go.
Yeah. Okay. Look, we got to move on from that, David. Let's just briefly have a look at this. 2 or 3 articles here, all mainly with the same theme. Washington Post here. The headline is, "Yes, Antifa is the moral equivalent of neo-Nazis." We've got the Atlantic's worrying about the rise of the violent left, and we've got Tom Woods suggesting the US is breaking up. But Antifa at the heart of this, all of these articles.
Yes. Now, this is the rise of the violent left, and you've actually got the Washington Post finally reporting it. They say, as if to prove Cummings' point, the Antifa movement responded with jackboots and clubs because their definition of fascist includes not just neo-Nazis, but also anyone who opposes their totalitarian worldview. And that's absolutely spot on. They also point out that the New York Times has published no fewer than 6 opinion pieces this year defending communism. Essays including an essay praising Lenin as a conservationist, explaining why Stalin inspired Americans, and arguing that the Bolsheviks were romantics at heart and that women had better sex under communism. So that's the nature of the mainstream left supporting the extremists. Now, the Tom Woods article is interesting because he talks about something that I'm starting to hear from, certainly from the libertarian-leaning parts of America. that the ideological and cultural differences are now so profound that the breakup of America has started. So that's what we should be looking for. You've got something like 30% of Californians support seceding from the Union. No one's calling them neo-Confederates because they're left-wing. And you're seeing a very great difference in viewpoint between the right and left in America. So distinct, and with such animosity between the two sides, that they are on the verge of ceasing to be one country, at least spiritually or ideologically or in their identity. And how long will it take that to manifest itself into physical reality? Time will tell.
Yeah. Okay, let's end with this subject and Brexit. I just wanted to briefly highlight this tweet from the Department for Exiting the European Union. And the text of the tweet is, "Watch David Davis closing the third round of negotiations to forge a new partnership with the EU." And all of the point I'm making here is that the gloves are off here in a sense. They're no longer even trying to hide what it is they're doing, Brian. This is not about leaving the European Union. It's not about Brexit. It's not about exit. As you've said before, it's Brexit without the exit. It's just B.
It's Brexit light.
Brexit light, because what we're doing is forging a new partnership.
Yeah, so another man deceiving the nation. And I couldn't resist this one because, what is it, the Times here saying EU wants billions in foreign aid, they say, because the budget is running to, that we signed into is running to 2020. We should be coughing up our share. So Michael Barnier, EU's chief negotiator, said it would not be fair if the remaining 27 member states were forced to make up shortfalls by Britain pulling out. So anywhere we go where there's money, look for the aid, because this is where the criminal activity takes place. And let's remember that the European Union has never, ever produced a set of fully audited and signed off accounts to show where its money goes, where British money goes. And for the British government to give such a corrupt organisation public money, that is a crime carried out by the members of Parliament, which is a happy note to end on. David, a couple of people have asked in the chat box, where is this all taking us? 20 seconds, where do you think?
We're going into a period of chaos. We should be looking for breaking apart of the United States as the last anchor in the world system that we all grew up with. And after that, all bets are off. There'll be very rapid change. I think we all need to learn to think much faster. Okay, thank you for that. And of course, the truth and exposing what's happening and pushing out the truth are important parts for making sure that new future goes in the right direction, the correct direction. Thanks very much for joining us. We will be back at 1 o'clock on Monday. See you then. Bye-bye.